Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's also a pleasure to see so many familiar faces in the audience. Making New Netherland history. When Sarah Henry, the Deputy Director of the museum, suggested that title, I immediately came up with the idea to focus on documents. How do we make history? History is not just a book that is written. History is something that we construct. We construct it from primary documents. And there is a whole process involved, the handwork of the historian, that I would like to illuminate to you here. What I will do is tell you about a couple of the documents, some of which are in the exhibition and others we've used for the exhibition. Tell you about what they are, where they are, which is an interesting story in itself sometimes, and then a little about the content. And finally, Charlie and I will take place on the podium, and then we will talk with each other. And if you let us, we'll be here for another 3-4 hours talking to each other about these documents. So please intervene, ask questions so that you get the answers to what you really want to know. So let me start off with the first document. In June 1664, Minister Henricus Selijns, who was serving the Dutch Reformed Church in Brooklyn, wrote a letter back to the classis in Amsterdam. The classis was, of course, the body that supervised the colonial churches. Selijns had requested for his release. He'd been in New Netherland for 4 years, and he wanted to go back to the Dutch Republic. His parents were getting on, and he wanted to be close to them in their final years. Of course, Selijns later came back to New York as a minister again to New York City. This document is interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, it was written in Brooklyn, sent to Amsterdam. So it was contained originally in the archives of the classes, which are kept in the Stadsarchief or Gemeentearchief of Amsterdam. But when in the early 1840s John Romain Brodhead was sent out by the state of New York to procure copies of documents, he asked for a number of letters of the Dutch Reformed Church ministers, and he was given permission to take those with him to America to make transcriptions there. A couple of years later, the Reformed Church in America asked to buy these letters. They did so for a sizable contribution to the pensioners' funds for widows of ministers in the Netherlands, and that's how this document ended up not in Amsterdam, where one would expect it, but rather in New Brunswick, in the archives of the Reformed Church. Selijns has a wonderful handwriting, so I'm sure you can all read this. And this is a particularly important passage on the second page of his letter. Selijns here writes about baptizing the slaves. And you can see baptism, of course, in Dutch is doop, which is the word here. In regard to the holy baptism, we are sometimes asked by the Negroes, I'll use that word here, because that's really what the Dutch used mostly, to baptize their children, kinderen as here. But we have until now refused to do so because they have little knowledge and little belief. Gebrek aan kennis en geloven. And the second argument, because the material aim of the Negroes in obtaining freedom for their children. Now, this has often been taken as the prime example of a change in baptisms of slaves in New Netherland. We know that many slaves were baptized in the 1630s and 1640s, but it seems to sort of taper off after that. And this is taken as one of the few direct documents, almost the smoking gun, you might say, of why this is happening. Even so, we should put this letter into context. First of all, This is not a decision that Selijns himself took personally. He makes clear that he has consulted on this with his colleagues in New Amsterdam. Secondly, this document is only testimony to what we might call a hardening of attitudes toward slaves that occurred everywhere in the Atlantic world. So it's not just New-Netherland where attitudes are changing. We find the same thing going on in Virginia, for instance. The main change in Atlantic slavery, which by that time was already 150 years old, was this hardening. Slavery from the 1650s onward became more geared towards production. Slaves were no longer regarded as being part of the household, for instance. Plantation slavery and the introduction of plantation slavery on the Caribbean islands, tobacco on Barbados, for instance, lies at the root of that. In the Caribbean, they changed over to cultivation of sugar, which requires a lot of labor, of course. In Virginia and Maryland, the changeover was to tobacco. So this is not just 1664, a single opinion of a single man. We should place it into a wider context. Let me go to my second document.